If you think back on taking biology classes, you probably remember learning about ecological succession, or how disturbances like forest fires or typhoons actually obliterate everything on the landscape. And then you might remember how these barren landscapes are rapidly colonized by fast-growing plants in what's called the exploitation stage. And eventually larger, slower-growing plants like trees take over in what is called the climax phase or the conservation phase. But more recently, ecologists have noted two additional phases, and these are called release and reorganization. And scientists have created what's called the adaptive cycle to explain or help us understand how these phases interact with each other. So the adaptive cycle captures two processes fundamental to social ecological systems resilience. The first is adaptation, and that's the ability of a system to adapt or make small changes, essentially to keep things going as is in response to minor disturbances. And this occurs largely in the conservation phase. The second process is transformation, and this is the ability to transform the system or make systemic changes in response to catastrophic disturbances. And this occurs in the reorganization phase. What I'm going to do now is talk about the stages of the adaptive cycle and the resilience processes of adaptation and transformation using examples of civic ecology practices in New York City. And I'm going to use New York City, but you can think of New York as any city or essentially any social ecological system. So you can imagine that we have a period of rapid growth followed by conservation, and so the city is pretty much at a steady state. But during this conservation stage, you're still going to get ongoing smaller disturbances, like a small flood. And civic ecology practices can play a role in responding to these small floods. So for example, you have this artificial wetland that's created by youth at the community organization Rocking the Boat, and it's helping to reduce runoff from a parking lot into the Bronx River. And then you'll get additional small flooding events, and you might have other civic ecology practices that help to mitigate these flooding events, such as this rooftop garden, where people are coming together and planting in pots and helping to absorb some of the runoff. But eventually, you're going to get some kind of catastrophic change, like Superstorm Sandy. And these kinds of catastrophic changes, they actually result in the destruction, essentially, of the ongoing processes of adaptation. So essentially what you have is the system has crossed a threshold or a tipping point. And processes, including civic ecology practices that were ongoing, might be obliterated or no longer are acting as they were. And this is called the release or the chaos phase. So what the system does next is it goes into the reorganization stage, and the reorganization stage involves larger transformation of the systems to try to reestablish or create new processes. And civic ecology practices can also play a role in the reorganization stage. So these include things like dune restoration or oyster reef restoration, where stewards are trying to re-engineer or transform coastlines so that they'll be more resilient to storm surges. So what you have in the adaptive cycle is you have civic ecology practices, whether they be artificial wetlands or rooftop gardens or oyster reef restoration or dune restoration, and they play a role in both the adaptation or conservation phase as well as in transformation during the reorganization phase of the adaptive cycle. And so you might ask, well, how can these what are the processes by which civic ecology practices contribute to both adaptation and transformation? Well, the reason that civic ecology practices can help a system both adapt and transform is because these practices embody some of the attributes of resilient social ecological systems. So these include things like they provision ecosystem services. And so, for example, you have that artificial wetland that can mitigate some of the runoff, or you have the dune restoration project that can protect shorelines, and you have social capital that's created as people are coming together. Civic ecology practices are also part of polycentric governance systems that include not only the small community organizations like Rocking the Boat, but also larger NGOs and government institutions. And then you can think of all these different dune restoration or oyster restoration or rooftop garden practices as small-scale innovations. And what these innovations do is allow people to learn by trial and error, or learn by doing. And then they can determine which of these innovations or experiments are most effective in helping a system both adapt and transform or be resilient in the face of different changes.